The narrator of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, a woman we know simply as Kathy H., informs us of her life's ups and downs in unremarkable terms, proceeding through memories of her childhood and teenage years at a gentle pace. But, drip by chilling drip, the horror of what Kathy is actually describing to us dawns, and the result is that the novel leaves its reader feeling bereft and devastated. It's a remarkable work of fiction, to my mind one of the best and most important novels to date in the 21st century. It was published in April 2005, and to mark its 20th anniversary, I'll be discussing and reflecting on the novel's impact. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel, we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people, and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama, and poetry. In each episode, I invite an author or expert to give their views on a particular text, and today I'm joined by Lara Colombino and Yugin, who've both written extensively on Kazuo Ishiguro. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, or indeed to reread it, and if you have anything to say about the novel or our conversation, please leave us a comment. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Lara Colombino is Professor of English Literature at the University of Genoa in Italy. She's the author of several books, including Ford Madox Ford, Vision, Visuality and Writing, and Spatial Politics in Contemporary London Literature, Writing, Architecture and the Body. Most relevant for this discussion, she's also author of Kazuo Ishiguro and Ethics, which was published this year, 2025, by Routledge. She also contributed a chapter to the Cambridge Companion to Kazuo Ishiguro, as indeed did both Yugin and myself. Yugin is Principal Academic in Communications and English in the Faculty of Media and Communication at the University of Bournemouth, UK. His research interests include memory and nostalgia in contemporary literature, science fiction, and care technologies. He's author of Kazuo Ishiguro and Memory, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan. It's a pleasure to welcome Yugin and Lara to the World Literature Podcast. Welcome, Lara and Yugin, to the World Literature Podcast. Great to have you on and to be talking about Never Let Me Go for its 20th anniversary of publication. So I thought we'd start by kind of reflecting, as it is, 20 years. So could you say something a bit about what did you make of Never Let Me Go when you first read it? And now, 20 years later, do you feel the same way? Have your feelings changed at all? Yugin, do you want to start us off?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thanks for inviting us to this podcast. When I first read Never Let Me Go, I was actually doing my doctoral studies in Ishiguro, and the novel had come out, and obviously I was going to read it straight away. I just remember when I was finishing the novel, I was in absolute floods of tears, I think, trying to finish it on the sofa, and thinking, this has left me in pieces, and Ishiguro's done it again. He has done a devastating ending, in the very last pages, and you kind of knew it was happening, but he did it anyway. But I just found it a very humane novel, not unlike anything he'd written before up to that point. And I really didn't have a problem with, the clothes not running away and all that sort of thing. That was the furore at the time. Looking back now, I'm shocked still by how prescient it is. Obviously, it's found a new audience with the young adult readership, and it's still in schools as a young adult book now. But I still find it very prescient about anything from the post-human to healthcare and technology, biopolitics. And who owns the body, what the body represents, what it means to be human, and the brevity of life, all those things that we're very much concerned now more than ever. are situated as key themes in the novel. And so I think that's how I feel about it now, that in a way it's more urgent than even the time when he wrote it about, cloning and Dolly the sheep. Those were his concerns then.
Yeah.
But now, with posthumanism and beyond kind of at the fore, I feel like the book has taken an even stronger sense of being, really prescient with our times. And yeah, that's how I feel about it now. In a way, a bit of disbelief, because, it feels it's set in a certain period decades ago, but the themes are still very current.
Yeah, I identified that emotional gut punch in first reading it. Just like, what was that, and was a little bit tentative going back to it. I read it very heavily at one point. Like you, I was actually doing my PhD. It was really central to what I was thinking about. So maybe overread it slightly, and if I go back to it, we'll have lost that. And I read it a week or two ago, and it hasn't. Still has the same effect. Laura, how about you?
Well, I think at first it was the science fiction aspect and its implications that drew me to the novel. More recently, I have begun to pay more attention to other aspects, such as the emotional landscapes in Ishiguro's own phrase, the kind of atmospheres he creates, which I think are highly metaphorical, but also charged, as it were, with intense emotion. And they are settings that, to me, linger in my mind like a sort of haunting melody for a very long time, even after I have put down the book, And what is very peculiar about these settings, I think, is that, Hailsham, the cottages, Norfolk, the motorways, they seem very minimalist settings sometimes. You don't have very rich descriptions as you would find, I don't know, in a 19th century novel. But they are also very symbolic, and they resonate with a very specific stage of the character's life, with sort of psychological and emotional phase of their existence. To some extent, it is a very peculiar kind of Bildungsroman. And there is something, I think, very similar. I mean, to me, it is very similar to Thomas Hardy's Tess of D'Urberville's to some extent, where you have different phases of Tess's life that correspond to different settings. And these settings seem to be a sort of projection of her psychological condition. And I think it is no accident that one of the perhaps the most widely read author at Hailsham, we are told, was precisely Thomas Hardy. So for some reason, these landscapes have attracted my attention recently. And also, I've become very interested in the sense of irresolution, which is at the heart of the novel. I mean, Kathy, especially as a carer, she's very compassionate, but at the same time, she's complicit with the system. And I think this contradiction is what makes her and other characters so interesting, because they are contradictory, just like human beings. They're nuanced. They're real.
Yeah. And can we stay with that relationship between care and complicity, Laura? Because, rereading it's always there from the beginning, but it really struck me that Kathy's overwhelming concern is for her relationships with the other Hailsham students, and for those relationships to remain smooth, avoiding any sort of, yes, they have their falling outs, but, she really wants to avoid anything that might cause any sort of rift between them. in some respects, it's quite a troubling proposition, actually, that this raises, you know, the idea that wanting the best for our own group, you know, kind of blinds them to the wider picture and therefore contributes to something quite horrific, or to use your term, complicit, you know, makes them complicit with it. So, you know, what do you think the novel actually has to say about these related concepts of care and empathy and their contribution to the horror that we see in the novel?
Yeah, again, there is this ambiguity, which I was referring to earlier. In many ways, the novel is a celebration of empathy, of the virtues of love and friendship. So I think Ishiguro wanted to write, first of all, a novel about how these emotions fit into people's lives, especially as they begin to realize that their time is short and mortality is a fact, which is something that we as humans tend to forget about. We tend to distance ourselves from the idea of death, whereas the clones have an intense awareness of it, which comes from the fact that they have a very short lifespan. Their life is sort of concertinaed, as Ishiguro says. So this makes their time more precious, more intense, more authentic. Kathy is particularly considerate, I think, from a very early stage. From a very early age, she tries to understand what is best for Ruth and Tommy. She never tries to push them to do something they're not prepared to do. And for example, when Ruth brags about her actually non-existent special connection with Miss Geraldine, despite being humiliated and rejected, Kathy doesn't expose the truth about, Ruth's lie. She understands that she has created this illusion for herself out of her need to be loved and admired. And later, as a carer, she's full of consideration and tireless energies. There is something almost saintly or Christ-like about her sacrifice. Incidentally, this association with Christ is also suggested by the fact that in the present of narration, she has turned 21. And so she's about to start donating. So there's just a couple of years maybe before she herself completes. So she's going to die probably around the age of Jesus Christ. So there are elements, I think, also of there are references, not just to literature, as I suggested earlier, but also to religion, which maybe would be worth exploring further. And all these characters, they seem to try and be empathetic with the others. Even Ruth, Ruth is the most selfish of the three, isn't she? And yet, at the end, she shows affection for both Kathy and Tommy, and she gives them Madame's address so that they can ask for a deferral. And this kind of affection that goes beyond death. I mean, this idea that you can do something for people that you care for, so that they may continue after your death to have a happy life. This is something that you do with children. So it's one of the ways in which we as humans try to overcome death, try to conquer that through love, through friendship, through art. I think Tommy tries to do that through art. But at the same time, we are aware that these bonds of affection have been sustained and fostered at Hailsham through a sort of through the teachings of Hailsham, through, for example, the practice of exchanges, which are meant to cement the bonds, so that one day, when they are adult, they may contribute to the smooth running of the donation system. So these bonds are both very intimate and born of ruthless manipulation. And this is, of course, a system, as you said, that Kathy contributes to. I think there is also another, if less obvious, way in which empathy is disturbing concept in a way, or is associated with something disturbing, which is that Kathy, from the very start, from the very beginning of the book, she says that she likes to pick and choose her donors. So this is something that you find also in Clara and the Sun, this idea that human beings or post-human beings tend to divide into camps, tend to lobby. By being loyal to one community or person over another, one inevitably betrays the rights or the legitimate aspirations of those who are excluded, I think. So for me, these are the two main problems around the concept of empathy.
And it's interesting that you, just to pick up on one thing you said there, as much as very interesting there, but you mentioned religion, and there's one line, I believe, in the novel in which God is mentioned directly, and it's when Tommy is starting to calm down and get some control over his temper, and Kathy says to him, "Did you find God?" or something, and the line really kind of jars, because elsewhere there are no real explicit references to it. You imagine Hailsham as a sort of traditional boarding school where people would sing hymns, but in terms of the dialogue, there's no direct references. But interesting to hear you kind of pick up on imagery that maybe more alludes to Christian iconography or Kathy as a Christ-like figure.
Because I think also the names that Ishiguro uses sometimes refer to names found in the Bible. Ruth herself, Ruth is the image of someone who has been abandoned, of a widow in the Bible. And I think he tries to find resonances to precisely because he's so minimalist with characterization, with landscapes. He tries to use just a few touches, as if in a sketch or a haiku, but they seem to contain so many echoes.
Well, Ishiguro is not one to bash you over the head either. He's, it's always subtle, right? Yugin, let's turn to you. Earlier you mentioned you find the novel incredibly prescient. So let's begin by thinking about it as a science fiction novel. We could class it as sci-fi. Arguably, it was never particularly interested in science in the sense that, it's not sort of thinking accurately, if you like, about cloning and how that works. Even when it was published in 2005, 20 years on, do you think that changes in the scientific, technological landscape also change the way that we read the novel? AI, of course, is a huge issue. I don't know how if that comes into your thinking. But yeah, how do you see the changes in science? Does that affect the way we read it now, do you think?
Well, when Ishiguro first, back in 2005, when he was doing interviews for the novel, I remember he famously said he wasn't interested in exploring what teacups looked like, in the future. He wasn't interested in that kind of science fiction. And I take it to mean that he wasn't interested in writing a hard science fiction type of novel, in the vein of Asimov, or someone where there's so much detail about the technology. But I think he is interested in science because of, his discussions when it comes to Clowen's son and his interest in the CRISPR, gene editing technology that came out, 10 years ago now or something like that. And so I think he's deeply interested in it. I think he just didn't want to be pigeonholed with a genre. I think his view of it is so much different now to back in 2005. But I personally, as someone who writes in that field, would very happily comfortably put that in the soft science fiction, almost Philip K. Dick kind of territory of science fiction, where the science isn't necessarily reasoned through in great detail, but it doesn't matter because the novel sucks you in so quickly into its setting, its premise, that you kind of, before you know it, you are in there. You're walking next to the characters. So certainly, I would, in terms of that, I would see that as now almost like a classic science fiction novel. And whether he liked it or not, the novel was shortlisted. I think, I can't remember which major science fiction prize, was it a Hugo or something, but it was shortlisted. So, I think the community certainly embraced the novel as such. In terms of what it is now, I think specifically now, with a lot of the concerns about, the environment, what's happening, and as you said, AI, but also different ways in which we as humans, particularly in the West, try to review the way we see ourselves and how technology can maybe enhance life and correct some wrongs, and particularly with the CRISPR technology, potentially, find cures. We're kind of going into Never Let Me Go territory, really. Maybe not from the particular direction of cloning, although, and with Margaret Atwood's, Oryx and Craig trilogy, so in the Mad Adam trilogy, she calls it, certainly, cloning is still very much a concern in terms of ethics, but also a potential for the future. But I think with regards to the idea of going beyond what we would traditionally see as human and blurring the line, certainly the novel very much deals with that before its time, if you like. And so I think the novel has I think aged well isn't probably the right phrase I was thinking of. But, even just, you're rooting for the clones in a way. You're looking for all the graduates of the schools in the novel. I find myself rooting for not just, the three friends of Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy, but for everyone from Hailstorm. I want them to survive. And I remember first reading the novel, catching myself going, I am rooting for the non-humans, as I read it then. A bit like when you read a novel and the main character is, an animal that, who you're aware of their sentience and, their inner thoughts. I felt the same, and suddenly it changed the way I viewed the novel at that point. And I think it does that to people as well. There's this uncanny reflective moment you have when you read it, and it is so important now, especially when people are trying to draw lines between where you stand on different things in terms of identity, whether it is to do with disabilities or to do with gender. I think the novel very much throws a lot of these questions out there in terms of what we see as human. Even the way memory is used, the clones very much are united by the memories of their time at Hailsham and their own identity that's unique. And And again, these are memories of supposedly, viewed as non-humans in that world of the novel. So what does that say about our status as humans? So I think in terms of that, 20 years on, I think if anything, it has this strange ability to kind of be very current with a lot of the scientific debates that's happening now in terms of technology to do with the body, so biotechnology, replacing organs and body parts, and how much of you is still human in that sense. And in terms of the future, cryotechnologies, genetic editing, and so on. In a way, it's quite often seen as a good companion piece to Clara and the Sun. And the novel's moved on from, I think, what someone once called it, the bewilderment trilogy, where you've got the experimentation, When We're Orphans, The Unconsoled, and Never Let Me Go. I think now is part of another trilogy of texts where Ishiguro is writing more speculatively, in a more fantastical way. So you've got Never Let Me Go, The Buried Giants. Unfortunately, Nocturne seems to always get knocked out of place in this. And then obviously with Clara and the Sun, who knows what he's going to do next, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But I think a lot of his writing is concerned with technology, and I think it probably will. This is just me, but I think it might become an even more timeless text than possibly even Clara. But that's just my feeling of it.
Okay, thank you. And just follow-up question, and this is to both of you. We talk about science fiction. A related genre is dystopian fiction. And it has been described as dystopian. You made the distinction between hard and soft sci-fi. Hard sci-fi being really concerned with technology, soft being more with the sort of social impact of it. I would say, you may challenge me on this if you want, that Never Let Me Go is not hard sci-fi in the same way as, say, 1984, or we just mentioned Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, where technology is really enforcing this dystopian political system, where people really can't move out of certain physical boundaries. In fact, the lack of some of those boundaries is quite striking in Never Let Me Go. Is it a dystopia, or is there a better description for it?
It's interesting you mentioned the lack of technology, because that's something the film adaptation, was it 2010 for Never Let Me Go? It's something that had to be dealt with because obviously visually you had to show something, and they had all those metal bracelets that they have to beep against a door. So they're trying to use, I guess, kind of current technology or ideas about it to try to lock something in with regards to concretizing some of these ideas that Ishiguro, very cleverly just alluded to, but didn't really give much detail. Whereas the film had to somehow come up with solutions to that in a practical way. I think if we see dystopia as the opposite of utopia, so the opposite of a no place or a good place, it brings to mind for me a very typical utopian dystopian conundrum that you get with the well-known science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin. She has a short story that's quite often taught, I think, in schools as a bit of a philosophical conundrum. It's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And it's about, obviously it's a speculative world, but there is a city or a town that's prosperous. It's like a utopia. Everyone is happy. Everyone has what they need. But what no one knows is, to keep this utopia going, there is this poor child locked away, I think, in a cupboard somewhere, where they have to do, I'm not sure, it's not given too much detail in terms of what they actually do, but in order for this city to be prosperous, this child has to be kept locked away in this cupboard. And occasionally, as children get older, they do pay a visit to see this child that's locked away and are horrified, but generally people carry on because they know, to make everyone happy, this one person has to suffer And those who are not happy with it ethically, then they decide to leave the city to an unknown world outside. They don't know what's going to happen to them. So it's why the title's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. But this story, I think, encapsulates this situation that's happening with dystopia, I think, in Never Let Me Go, where the general population has reached a point where I think Hailsham has lost that battle of trying to present a more ethical, a view of the clones. Are they human? Can they produce art? And the national view of clones is, we need them, but we don't really want to see them or talk about them. And in a way, that's exactly it. So in order for there to be a utopian outcome for some people, there always has to be a dystopian outcome for others, because, and as the way the world is, has always been, you always have people who are marginalized or the unseen, who work hard in unjust environments in order to prop up the world of the privileged. I think this is something Ishiguro addresses, in different ways in the novel, and for me that makes it a dystopia, because the novel focuses on the ones who are actually suffering to keep everyone alive and happy and well, and that goes back to this old story from Le Guin about it's a utopia for some, but from the point of view of that child, in the cupboard, it is an absolute dystopia. So you can flip it both ways if you like. So for me, it is from that kind of philosophical conundrum kind of point of view.
Lara, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, maybe the most interesting aspect for me about this dystopia is that it is set in a recent past, because we tend to see dystopian fiction or science fiction in the far future, but there are novelists who such as Ishiguro, who prefer to another example is Machines Like Me by McEwan, which is a great novel, I think, but it's very interesting. And it is set in an alternative past. So there must be something in the air which leads so many writers, more or less of the same generation, that at this moment in time, this moment of history, are led to conceive novels which seem to be both familiar and provoke this sense of estrangement. I think the fact of placing them in the recent past is very rich in possibilities, because, for example, at the end of the book, when we come to know, and Kathy and Tommy finally know how the whole thing of donations developed, you also have an alternative view of the 60s or the idealism of the 60s, which in that alternative world has to do with trying to make the conditions for the clones more humane. So I found it really fascinating, and I think it's part of the reason why there isn't so much technology after all, precisely because it has to be set in the recent past, and it has to give us, to some extent, a sense of familiarity. It's something we have lived, but we haven't lived at the same time. And the same can be said precisely of Machines Like Me. So this idea that, in a way, perhaps our time is very fragile, is an improbable construct. You don't really know where things are going. And this is something that you find also in Clara and the Sun, this idea that we're sort of poised between very different diverging possibilities.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of the reasons I think why the two novels resonate in many respects.
I think in his Nobel Prize speech, he mentioned the missed opportunities of his generation as well, didn't he? So sort of sense of regret. I think of Stevens in The Remains of the Day. He talks about turning points, these turning points in your life, but you kind of don't necessarily know what they are till they've gone. And I think, yeah, to bring that back to dystopia, it's almost, you know, when you have a hard dystopia like 1984 Handmaid's Tale, it's like, oh, you know, it's kind of crystal clear what the sort of moral schema is, but Never Let Me Go, it's much less clear. Maybe you're already going down that path and you never realize you quite got on that path, which is a disturbing proposition in many ways, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
Sorry, did you have something to add?
Please go.
Okay, let's take a break. And then when we come back, we can talk a bit more about your particular interests with respect to Ishiguro. So thank you very much for your answers so far. And please, everybody, do join us for part 2.